I want to be clear about something before I explain what happened at Karev Basin, because people have been telling the story wrong for 3 years, and I am tired of the version that makes us sound clever. We were not clever. We were broken, we were bleeding, and we happened to be broken in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. The Vethrak left because their instruments told them to. That is the whole story. The instruments were not wrong, exactly. They were just reading a version of us that their architects had never thought to account for. I filled out the tags. That part is true, every one of them. I want that on the record. My name is Davin Voss. I held the rank of Sergeant, Corpsman 3rd grade, assigned to the 14th Forward Medical Element, Karev Basin Garrison, during the 2nd year of the Vethrak incursion into the outer settlements. I am writing this at the request of the Joint Inquiry, but I am writing it in my own words because the official summary they drafted leaves out the crackers, and if you leave out the crackers, you leave out the whole point. I will start with what the Vethrak are, or at least what they were during the incursion, because their doctrine is the mechanism that made everything possible. They are not a warrior culture in any sense that a human soldier would recognize. They do not value the fight. They value the assessment. Every Vethrak military action begins with a survey phase, a detailed biological scan of the target area using their threaded field resonance equipment, which can read pulse rate, respiratory volume, core temperature, and several secondary metabolic markers through walls, through soil, through most of the materials we build our forward stations from. The scan produces what they call a viability index for every life sign in the target zone. The index has one practical output: combatant or non-combatant, viable threat or not. They built this system because they are efficient above everything else. They do not commit ground forces to a position that does not require ground forces. If the scan returns 0 viable combatants, they reclassify the position as a recovery site, a place to be cataloged and processed later, after the actual fighting is done elsewhere. They do not waste soldiers on corpses. The threshold that separates viable from non-viable was set, as best we later understood it, from a survey of 17 spacefaring species conducted over roughly 4 centuries of Vethrak expansion. For each species, they had mapped the biological floor, the minimum vital signs at which a specimen of that species could still be assessed as a functional threat. Below those numbers, the specimen was, by definition, not going to fight. It was dying or dead, or so severely compromised that engaging it would be an inefficiency. Their expansion had been built, century after century, on the logic that you do not spend resources breaking something that is already broken. It is a sound doctrine. I want to acknowledge that before I explain where it fails. As military logic goes, it is efficient, it is data-driven, and it has probably saved them considerable cost across 400 years of operations. The failure is not in the doctrine. The failure is in a gap between two things that look identical from the outside: an organism that cannot fight and an organism that should not be able to fight but has not yet stopped. For humans, they had run those surveys. They had baseline data. They knew our resting pulse range, our respiratory norms, our temperature envelope. They had a file on all of it, compiled, we later discovered, from a combination of passive scans conducted during the early contact period and records obtained from a medical exchange program that had been proposed by the Heskett IV colonial administration 3 years before the incursion began, in a period when everyone involved was still pretending the relationship was going somewhere constructive. The exchange had produced, among other documents, a human cardiovascular reference guide intended for Vethrak medical researchers. It included normal ranges for healthy adults across several demographic categories. It was thorough and accurate. What it did not include, because no medical reference guide for healthy adults includes it, is what happens to those numbers in a human being who has been in continuous combat operations for 11 months, been wounded twice, is running on 4 hours of fragmented sleep per night, has not eaten a complete meal in 6 days, and is choosing to eat crackers instead of stopping. I need to explain Karev Basin. The basin sits at the bottom of a dry river valley on the colony world Heskett IV, which is a dull name for a dull planet, red clay soil, scrub vegetation that smells faintly of turpentine when the wind is right. 2 small moons that are not interesting enough to have acquired informal names among the garrison. The garrison itself was a prefabricated forward operating base built on a shallow rise above the basin floor, with our aid station occupying the eastern cluster of structures. 4 connected modules with corrugated aluminum walls and a partial overhead cover made of the same panels. Noon light came through the gaps in long bright bars that swept across the floor as the sun moved. In the mornings, the whole space smelled of antiseptic and hot metal. By afternoon, it smelled of antiseptic and sweat, and the specific, complicated smell of people who have been through something and are still in the middle of processing it. The modules had been intended as temporary. They always are. 11 months in, the temporary structures had accumulated the kind of density that buildings acquire when people live in them hard. Gear hung on every hook and protrusion. A board near the entrance covered in notes and rosters that nobody had taken down because they served as a record of who had been there. Seams in the wall panels plugged with foam sealant that had cured to a dark yellow and cracked at the edges. There was a particular smell that I associated with the place, distinct from the antiseptic, that I have not been able to identify since, and that I am told is a normal psychological attachment phenomenon. I am including this detail because I want whoever reads this document to understand that the aid station at Karev Basin was a real place where real people lived and were treated, not a backdrop for an interesting tactical event. We had been there for 11 months when the Vethrak pushed through the Heskett IV orbital perimeter and began their ground clearance operations. They moved methodically as they always did, settlement by settlement, outpost by outpost, scanning ahead of their advance and bringing force only where their instruments told them it was warranted. They had been given a timeline for sector clearance, and they were, by every intelligence assessment we had, on track to meet it. It took them 6 weeks to reach the basin. In those 6 weeks, we did not sit still. We ran supply lines in the contested corridors, moving under cover of the valley's terrain and the sensor shadows created by the ridge geology. We evacuated civilians, 340 of them from the basin settlement and the surrounding homesteads, coordinated by Lieutenant Caro until the 12th day, when we lost Lieutenant Caro. After that, the civilian evacuation coordination passed to Sergeant First Class Adiz Nwasu, who was 26 years old and had no experience with civilian logistics, and managed it through a combination of methodical planning and a refusal to acknowledge the possibility that any of the 70-odd transits she organized might not go correctly. They all went correctly. Nwasu was later awarded a commendation for the operation. She was on a cot in the aid station when the Vethrak survey team arrived, recovering from a fragmentation wound to the upper left arm, and her tag read, Pulse 68, Resp 15, Temp 36.3, Status, Yellow. She was writing in a notebook when the survey vehicles came into view, and she did not stop writing. We lost people. We lost Lieutenant Caro on the 12th day and Corpsman Alyssa Hike on the 21st, and 4 soldiers whose names I have written down in a separate place, because I do not want to put them in this document where they might be read by people looking for an interesting story. They are not part of anyone's interesting story. They were doing their jobs and they are gone, and that is where I will leave that. By the time the Vethrak advance element reached the basin approach, the garrison had taken significant casualties, and the survivors were in a state I will describe as honestly as I can. We were functional, but we were not what anyone would call healthy. I had 23 patients in the aid station at the time of the survey. 6 more were mobile but walking wounded, cuts, burns, 1 broken hand that Sergeant Priya Lekundran had taped up herself and refused to let me look at for 4 days. The rest of the garrison's effective strength was concentrated in the outer perimeter positions, which numbered fewer people than the table of organization called for, and more determination than the table of organization had a column for. Here is what I want you to understand about the state of those 23 patients. Every one of them was alive. Not comfortably alive, not well-rested alive, but alive in the functional sense, conscious, or intermittently conscious, capable of response. Private Tail Morrow had been treated for a collapsed lung 48 hours earlier, and his respiratory rate was sitting at approximately 5 to 6 breaths per minute, which I want to note is genuinely concerning and would under normal circumstances have had me arranging medevac within the hour. Under the circumstances available to me at Karev Basin, what I had arranged was a chest tube, supplemental oxygen from the last functional cylinder in the station, and instructions for Morrow to breathe carefully and tell me if anything changed. His pulse was 44. He was lying on his cot reading a technical manual about irrigation system maintenance that he had found in the station's small library box and that he had now read twice. He told me, when I asked, that he was finding the second read more informative than the first, because the first time he had been distracted by the tube. Corporal Danny Suresh had a core temperature of 35.2 degrees Celsius after blood loss and 2 days of inadequate fluid replacement, despite my best efforts, because we were short on IV supplies, and she kept giving hers to the soldier in the next cot when she thought I was not watching. I was watching. I did not say anything the second time because I was trying to decide whether the argument was worth the energy expenditure on her part, and concluded it was not. Her pulse was 61, which was the highest number in the station. Her temperature was low and she knew it, and she had wrapped herself in the thermal blanket from her cot and the thermal blanket from the cot next to hers, which was unoccupied, and she was wearing a jacket over the blankets, and she was still cold. I checked on her every 40 minutes. Sergeant First Class Odie Brannon, the man who would, 3 days later, walk 14 kilometers to the relay station at Heskett Outpost 9 and bring back the resupply that got us all out, had a resting pulse of 39 beats per minute, which I had been monitoring with increasing personal discomfort for 18 hours, and which had not changed. He told me it had always run low. His father had the same thing, he said. His father had been turned away from the Colonial Militia's medical screening at age 19 for a resting pulse of 37 and had lived to 91. Brannon was 44 years old, had been in continuous military service for 22 of those years, and had what I can describe only as a complete physiological equanimity about the state of his own body that I, as a medical professional, found alternatively reassuring and alarming depending on how I was thinking about it. He was sitting on his cot with his boots on. He had maps laid out across his knees. He was eating dried protein blocks, the same terrible logistics contractor product as the crackers, similar flavor profile but without the structural integrity. And he was doing something with a pencil that I later learned was calculating optimal transit routes between the basin and Outpost 9 under 3 different scenarios of variable Vethrak patrol density. I had filled out triage tags on all of them. This is standard procedure. You fill them out when the patient arrives, you update them as status changes, and you clip them to the patient's collar or wrist, so that in the event of a mass casualty situation, any responder can get a rapid picture of the patient's current status without having to run full assessment again. The tags are color-coded: green for stable, yellow for urgent but stable, red for immediate, black for expectant. And they include a quick reference vital signs strip where you write the numbers in grease pencil so they can be updated easily. I had updated them that morning. I had gone through every patient at approximately 6:30, taken vitals, and updated every tag in the station. This had taken 45 minutes. Morrow's tag read: pulse 44, resp 5, temp 36.8, status yellow with a note that said pneumothorax resolving, continue O2, monitor closely. Suresh's tag: Pulse 61, Resp 14, Temp 35.2 status, yellow with a note about temperature trending. Brannan's tag, Pulse 39, Resp 12, Temp 36.9 status, yellow note reading bradycardia, baseline per patient report, 18 HRS stable monitoring. Nwasu's tag, Pulse 68, Resp 15, Temp 36.3 status, yellow note frag wound L upper arm secondary closure holding, and so on 23 times down the rows. I had also, at some point in the previous 12 hours that I am slightly embarrassed about in a professional sense, filled out a tag for myself. Not because I was a patient, I was not. I was the medic, I was functioning. But because we had been taking intermittent fire since the previous evening and I was tired, and the kind of tired that makes you do things on autopilot and then notice them later. I had a laceration on my left forearm from a panel fragment that had come off a wall strut when a near miss rattled the structure around 2200 hours the previous night. The laceration was about 4 centimeters, moderately deep, not requiring sutures but wanting proper management. I had closed it with steri strips and a light wrap while doing the overnight rounds, and I had made a note to chart it in the morning. And then the morning had happened in the way that mornings at Karev Basin happened, continuously, and without adequate pauses. And I had not charted it anywhere except on the tag I had filled out at some point and clipped to my own collar. The numbers I wrote: Pulse 51, Resp 11, Temp 36.7, status, yellow note lack L forearm closed monitoring. My own pulse of 51 was not a cause for concern. In a healthy sedentary person it would have been unremarkable, a little low but within normal variation. In a field medic who had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in a week, and who had been consuming caffeine as a primary food group since approximately day 30 of the incursion, a pulse of 51 represented the specific physiological state of being so far past the edge of normal that the body had stopped making new adrenaline because it had concluded that the threat environment was simply baseline reality. I did not think much about the tag after I clipped it on. I had a great deal of other things to think about. At approximately 11:40 hours on the 43rd day of the Vethrak advance, our perimeter sensors logged the approach of a Vethrak survey element. Not a combat unit, their field signatures were different, and our intelligence briefings had covered the distinction in detail. This was the Threaded Field Resonance Team, 3 vehicles in their standard survey configuration. The primary scanning chassis, flanked by 2 smaller data relay units that transmitted the survey results back to the advanced command element in real time. They came from the north end of the Basin Road and halted approximately 200 meters from our outer perimeter wire. The garrison had a standing protocol for this. Do not initiate contact during a Vethrak survey phase. Maintain position. Do not exert. Let the scan run. The reasoning was laid out in the command guidance. The Vethrak survey doctrine was predictable, and the predictability was something we could potentially use. If the scan returned non-viable results, the advance element would bypass the position. The protocol was to give them the clearest possible picture of what we actually were. What we actually were, at 11:40 hours on day 43, was what I have described. 23 patients in the aid station, 6 mobile wounded deployed to various positions around the perimeter under protest, and the remainder of the garrison's effective strength at the outer posts, most of them in some condition that I would have preferred to formally evaluate and document. I was sitting on my cot. I want to be precise about this. I was not standing at a window. I was not observing the survey vehicles with tactical alertness. I was sitting on my cot in the eastern module of the aid station, with the box of crackers on the storage unit beside me and a cracker in my hand, watching the noon light move across the floor in bright bars and thinking about the inventory. We were down to 11 IV bags. We had enough dressing material for approximately 4 more days at current consumption. We had a functional defibrillator, a non-functional portable ultrasound, and 2 ventilators, one of which worked, and one of which I had been cannibalizing for parts to keep the first one running. I had a list in my head of every supply item I needed, and the order in which I would request them when extraction became possible. And I was going through that list for approximately the 40th time when the motion on my peripheral vision resolved into the shape of 3 Vethrak vehicles halting at the wire. I looked up through the gap in the wall panels. I looked at the vehicles. I looked at the extended sensor arms beginning their slow outward sweep. 8 minutes per their standard operating profile. I had 8 minutes while the scan ran, and then some amount of time while the data transmitted and the advanced command element reviewed it and made its determination. I looked around the station. Morrow was on his cot with his irrigation manual. The tube in his chest moved slightly with each shallow breath, 5, maybe 6 per minute, labored and careful, pulse 44. Suresh was apparently asleep, face slack, buried in her 2 thermal blankets. Pulse 61, temperature 35.2. Brannon had his maps and his pencil and his protein blocks. Pulse 39. Enwasu was writing in her notebook, but she wrote without moving much, small, precise movements, the pen barely lifting, her arm close to her body. Pulse 68. The other 19 patients across the 2 connected modules were variously resting, sleeping, reading, staring, or lying in the specific unmoving way that people lie when they are in enough pain that stillness is the only position that is not worse than stillness. Everyone in the station had a tag clipped to their collar. Every tag had been updated at 6:30. Every tag had numbers on it. I looked at my own tag. I turned it so I could read the grease pencil in the noon light. Pulse 51, Resp 11. Then I thought clearly and in sequence about the Vethrak threaded field resonance system, about what it measured, about what the numbers on the tag said to the system that was measuring them, about the threshold, about 45. Morrow's pulse was 44. Brannon's pulse was 39. My pulse was 51, which was above 45, and I noticed that I was suddenly aware of my own heartbeat in a way that I had not been 30 seconds earlier, and that the awareness was not helping. I sat very still. I took a slow breath. I ate the cracker. I want to be absolutely clear. I did not decide to eat the cracker as a tactical gesture. I ate it because it was in my hand, and I was in the middle of eating it when I looked up and saw the survey vehicles, and my brain had already processed the logic before it had finished communicating it to my hands. The cracker was eaten in the same motion as the comprehension. It was not a demonstration of anything. I was hungry, and it was there. But after I finished that one, I did consciously take another. And I ate that one carefully, without rushing, because rushing increases respiratory rate, and I had concluded in the space of about 15 seconds that the most useful thing I could do for the next 8 minutes was to be, measurably, as close to non-viable as I could get without actually stopping. I need to explain the gap between what I understood in that moment and what I was able to do about it from a tactical standpoint. The answer is not much. I could not communicate with the perimeter soldiers without creating a signal that might be detectable. I could not adjust my patient's vital signs in any direction that would have been medically sound. I could not, and this was the thought that sat in the back of my mind for all 8 minutes, I could not make myself less visible to the scanner. I was in the station. The scanner was going to read me. Pulse 51 was above the threshold that I was operating on a theory about, and I was above it, and there was nothing to do about it except breathe slowly and try not to think about it too hard. Private Morrow looked up from his manual. He had been reading it with the kind of focused attention that is only possible in people who have already exhausted all other mental options, and I could see from the angle of his head that he had heard or sensed or in some way registered the change in the situation. He looked at me. I did not say anything. He looked past me, through the panel gap at the survey vehicles. He looked back at me. He put the manual down. He lay back on his cot with a deliberateness that was not the deliberateness of a man settling in to rest. He put his hands folded on his chest, which gave him the inert, composed appearance of a person who had made a permanent peace with horizontal. His breathing, already shallow, did not change. His pulse, already 44, did not change. But the act of lying back in that particular way, hands folded, face neutral, eyes closed, it was the act of a man who had understood the geometry of the situation from a different angle than I had, and had arrived at the same destination. I did not know then that he had figured it out. I found out later when I asked him, and he said he had not been certain. He had only noticed that the vehicles were outside and that I was eating the cracker with unusual deliberateness, and that two things together meant something he should probably pay attention to. He said he had reasoned that lying still was probably better than not lying still, regardless of what exactly was happening, because he could always lie still more and then stop lying still when it was clear the situation had resolved, but he could not unmove if moving turned out to be wrong. This is the kind of reasoning I have come to associate with the people who survive extended operations intact. A preference for reversible actions over irreversible ones, sustained across many small decisions over a long time. I looked at Suresh. She was already in the configuration she had been in for the past 20 minutes. Blankets, jacket, stillness. Pulse 61, temperature 35.2. The temperature would read as low to the Vethrak instruments. I did not know exactly what their temperature threshold was, but I knew that 35.2 was well below the low end of normal human range, and the scanner was built to flag anomalies. I was working on theory. I was building a model of their system from the outside, based on what I knew of their doctrine and the one piece of captured survey documentation that had been circulated in the intelligence briefings, and the model said, they are looking for viable. Viable means warm, beating, breathing in the normal range. Everything in the station is cold, slow, and barely there. I looked at Brannon. Brannon was not looking at me. He had not looked up when the vehicles arrived. He had folded his map slightly to bring a particular section closer, and he was marking something on it with his pencil, and he was eating his protein block, and his pulse was 39 beats per minute. I thought, either Brannon does not know the survey vehicles are there, or Brannon knows the survey vehicles are there, and has concluded that the best response is to continue what he was doing, because what he was doing was already the optimal response. I still do not know which of those was true. I never asked him, and he never volunteered it. The scan ran for 8 minutes and 40 seconds, by my count. I counted because I had nothing else to do with my attention, except count and breathe slowly and try to keep my heartbeat in a range that I was now intensely aware was 51 beats per minute. When the sensor arms began to retract, I let myself exhale. Then I started on a third cracker, because I needed to do something with my hands, and the cracker box was right there. The vehicles did not move for another 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, based on the post-incident analysis of their communications traffic, their survey system transmitted the scan results to the advanced command element. The advanced command element ran the viability index for the position, and someone in that command element reviewed the results and issued the reclassification order. What I know is that after 11 minutes, the three vehicles turned around. They turned around in the same methodical, unhurried way that they had arrived, no urgency, no acceleration, just the smooth rotation of a survey team that had completed a task and was moving to the next one. They drove back the way they had come, up the Basin Road, and the sound of their drive units faded and then was gone. I watched them go. Morrow sat up. He picked up his irrigation manual. He held it for a moment without opening it. Then he said, "They left." "Yes," I said. "Because of the tags," he said. "Because of the tags," I said. "And because your pulse is 44, and because Brannon's is 39, and because Suresh runs cold, and because apparently every single person in this station is operating below what their system calls viable." Morrow thought about this. "All of us," he said. 31 life signs in the station. Everyone flagged non-viable per what we recovered later, not one exception. He was quiet. He opened the manual again, but he did not read it for a moment. He held it open and looked at the text without seeing it. Then he said, "What was the threshold?" 45 for pulse. Their system weights pulse heavily. Below 45, a human reads as non-viable on their assessment model. My pulse is 44. Yes. And yours? 51, I said. Which is above it? He looked at me. I looked at him. We both looked at the gap in the wall panel where the survey vehicles had been visible, which was now just the empty basin road in noon light. But they still left, he said. The station as a whole read non-viable. I don't know exactly how their system aggregates. Maybe one marginal reading doesn't override the consensus of 30. Maybe 51, in a station where the average is somewhere around 44, reads as an artifact. Maybe the advanced command element looked at 31 non-viable readings and didn't look hard enough at the one that was technically borderline. I paused. Or maybe my pulse came down during the scan. I was trying to keep it down. Were you eating a cracker? He said. I was on my third cracker, I said. He nodded. He did not say anything else for a while. He put the manual down again, put his hands in his lap, and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man cataloging something he will think about for a long time. I went to check on Suresh. She was awake. She had been awake, she told me, since the perimeter sensors logged the approach. She did not have access to the sensor feed directly, but she had heard the change in my movement pattern and known something was happening. And when she looked through the half-open section of her blanket and saw the survey vehicles through the panel gap, she had made a decision. She had closed her eyes and stayed where she was and not moved. She had done this, she explained, because she did not know exactly what the Vethrak sensors measured, but she knew that moving would be worse than not moving, and she was tired, and not moving was consistent with being tired, and so she had not moved. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "How long were you awake?" "Since before the scan started," she said. "I watched through the blanket until the arm deployed. Then I closed my eyes." "You watched the arm deploy?" "I wanted to know what was happening," she said. "Then I decided I should look dead." She said it exactly that flat. She was reporting a decision she had made. She had wanted information, she had obtained it. She had then taken the logical subsequent action, which was to present as inert. I said, "And then they left." "And then they left," she said. Her voice was factual. She pulled the blanket closer. I took her pulse. 61. Temperature 35.4, the quarter-degree improvement I had been working toward. I made a note. I updated her tag, and then I looked at the updated tag and thought about the recovery team. The Vethrak Advance element had classified the station as a recovery site. A recovery site, by their doctrine, was scheduled for processing after the sector was cleared, a logistics operation, not a combat one. A recovery team would come. Recovery teams operated on a lower resolution census system than the advanced survey element, not designed for individual assessment but for broad area census, confirming the absence of viable combatants before committing recovery personnel to the task of processing the site. But they would scan. If anything in the station had improved materially by the time they arrived, we had a problem. I went to the communications console and drafted a priority message to Garrison Command. I kept it brief. Vethrak survey complete. Station classified non-viable. Advance element has withdrawn. Recovery team anticipated. Request guidance on posture and extraction timeline. I sent it and went back to the patients. The reply came 42 minutes later. It said, "Understood. Extraction window opening in approximately 9 hours. Hold position. Maintain current posture." I read that twice. Maintain current posture. It was, as orders go, one of the more straightforward I had received at Karev Basin, and also one of the more complicated in practice. I briefed everyone. This took time. My patients were not in uniform condition for receiving complex tactical information, so I kept the brief simple. The Vethrak survey team read us as dead. They left. A recovery team will come later. They will scan from the outside. We need to still look dead when they do. Stay on the cots. Do not exert. If you need something, tell me, I will get it. Nobody moves more than necessary. Corporal Wren Hassel, whose thoracic wound had reduced her lung capacity by approximately 30%, and who was therefore running a resting respiratory rate of 7, looked at me from her cot and said, "How long?" 9 hours to extraction, I said. She said, "I can do 9 hours." This was, I want to note, an entirely accurate self-assessment. Hassel had been doing things she probably could not do for 43 days, and 9 hours was not going to be the threshold at which that changed. Brannon looked up from his maps when I got to him. He said, "Their survey team came through." "Yes." "They read us non-viable and withdrew." "Yes." "Because we are all below their threshold." Below or close enough to it that the overall read was 0 viable combatants. He sat with this for a moment. He had one of the protein blocks in his hand, and he was turning it over slowly, which I had come to recognize as what Brannon did when he was working through something. Then he said, "My pulse has always run low." "I know. Doctors have told me it was a problem my whole career. In a healthy adult with no other indicators, a resting pulse of 39 is something a physician wants to investigate. It can indicate cardiac conduction issues, among other things. But, in a context where the relevant question is whether you read as viable to a Vethrak survey scanner, a resting pulse of 39 is the reason this station is still standing." He did not say anything to that. He looked back at his maps for a long moment. Then he said, "What did your pulse run at?" 51, marginally above threshold. I was trying to keep it down. "Were you eating something?" "Crackers," I said. "Yes." He looked at me. His expression did not change. Brannon's face operated on a very narrow register, which I had learned to read in finer gradations over 11 months. What I read now was something I would describe as a kind of dry, reluctant acknowledgement, not amusement. Just, yes, that is what it was. He said 9 hours. "Approximately. I would like you to rest for 8.5. And then walk to Outpost 9. That is what the extraction plan calls for, yes." He did not argue. He put the protein block down, folded his maps in precise quarters, set them on the floor beside the cot, and lay back. He closed his eyes. He had the complete stillness of a man who has decided to sleep and will sleep, regardless of the surrounding conditions, because his body knows how. His pulse, when I checked 40 minutes later, was 36. I went back to my cot. I thought about the crackers. I was still hungry. I was, if I was being honest, more hungry than I had been at any point in the preceding 43 days, which I attributed partly to genuine caloric deficit, and partly to the fact that sitting still and breathing slowly for 8 minutes, and then having the survey vehicles drive away, had produced a physiological release that was consuming energy. I took 2 crackers out of the box. I ate them at the pace I had been eating them for the past hour, deliberately, without hurrying, giving each one the attention it deserved, which was not very much attention because they tasted like salted cardboard, but which I was providing anyway because it gave me something to think about. That was not the recovery team or the extraction window or the list of supplies I needed. The afternoon passed. The noon light moved across the floor and became afternoon light and began to angle toward the western panels. I did rounds every 45 minutes. I updated tags where numbers had changed. I kept a separate log in my head of every patient's trajectory over the past 24 hours, tracking direction rather than absolute value, which way each number was moving, at what rate, and whether the rate was changing. It is the kind of calculation that becomes automatic after long enough in a field station. You stop thinking of each reading as a data point and start thinking of it as a vector. Suresh's temperature came up another fraction. I noted it. By 1400 hours, she was at 35.6, and she had stopped wearing the second blanket and was reading Nwasu's notebook. Nwasu had apparently passed it to her to review the civilian transit logs, because Suresh had helped coordinate the last 4 evacuations, and Nwasu wanted another set of eyes on the timeline documentation. They were doing logistics from adjacent cots, speaking in quiet voices, with a shared pencil. Morrow's respiratory rate moved from 5 to 6 and back to 5. I noted it. The chest tube was doing what it was supposed to do, and the lung was slowly reinflating, which was the correct direction, and the rate of reinflation suggested that by the time we reached proper surgical care, the lung would be at sufficient capacity for him to travel without supplemental oxygen. I noted that too. For the handover brief I was already composing in my head for whoever received us at the extraction destination. Corporal Jaron Yaw, who had a compound fracture of the right tibia that I had stabilized with what I had available, and which was going to need proper surgical management within the next 48 hours, was running a fever of 37.8 that I was watching but not yet treating, partly because the available antipyretics were not something I wanted to use casually, and partly because the fever was keeping his core temperature solidly in range, which in the context of the morning's events I was not entirely opposed to. Yaw was 28, from one of the outer settlements on Heskett III, and had the specific stoicism of people who grow up in places where medical infrastructure is several hours away, and complaining about pain accomplishes nothing practical. When I updated his tag and told him his temperature was slightly elevated, he said, "Is that a problem?" I said it was something I was monitoring. He said, "Okay," and went back to sleep. Private First Class Sena Kowalczyk had been in the station for 9 days with a penetrating wound to the upper abdomen that had required field surgery I prefer not to describe in detail, and that had, against reasonable probability, not developed the secondary infection I had been anticipating since day 3. Her vitals had been stable for 4 days. By that afternoon her pulse was 64, her temperature 36.8, and she had asked me twice to discharge her to the perimeter. Both times I told her she was not ready. Both times she said the perimeter was short-handed. Both times I told her the perimeter was aware of the staffing situation and was managing, and that she was not going anywhere until the drainage had been clean for 48 consecutive hours. She accepted this, but she made a point of sitting up in her cot rather than lying down, and she kept her gear in arm's reach. Looking around the station at 1500 hours, I made an accounting of what we were. 23 patients with triage tags, 6 mobile wounded who had come back in and were resting as ordered, 29 people in a prefabricated aluminum structure on a rise above a dry river valley on a planet that 2 survey teams had now confirmed was empty of viable combatants. I thought about the word viable. I had been thinking about it intermittently since the morning. It is a word with a specific meaning in medicine, capable of surviving, capable of normal function, and it has a different but related meaning in military assessment, capable of posing a threat, capable of continuing to fight. The Vethrak had defined it by threshold. Below this pulse, you are not viable. Below this temperature, not viable. Below this respiratory rate, not viable. It is a clean definition. It has the virtue of being measurable. What it does not have is any way to account for what a person will do when they are below the threshold, and they still have 9 hours to get through. I looked at Brannon. He was asleep. His chest rose and fell with a regularity that I found, as always, slightly unnerving in a man his age with his history. That kind of deep, slow, absolute sleep is something most people lose in their 30s. His maps were folded on the floor beside him. His pulse, per the monitoring strip I had attached to his wrist, was reading 36. I thought, This man is going to walk 14 kilometers tomorrow. I thought. The Vethrak scanner looked at a pulse of 36 and read, not viable. I thought, it is right. He is not viable. He is also going to walk 14 kilometers tomorrow and bring back the resupply that gets 29 people out of here. And those two things are both true simultaneously, and the instrument can only see one of them. I went back to my cot. I took another cracker. I ate it slowly, not because I had to, but because the morning's habit had settled into something and I was not ready to break it yet. The afternoon light was amber through the panels. Somewhere outside, distant to the north, the direction the advance element had continued, there was the faint sound of Vethrak operations. Not close, not getting closer, moving away. I ate the cracker and listened to it move away. At 19:30 hours, the perimeter sensors logged 2 vehicles approaching from the same direction as the morning survey team. 2 vehicles, lower profile, the signature consistent with a Vethrak logistics unit rather than a combat element. The recovery team. I noted the time. I noted the entry in the log I had been keeping since 11:40 hours. I sat down on my cot, and I took a cracker out of the box, and I looked at it for a moment. The box was most of the way through. I had been eating crackers since morning, not steadily but in the way you eat things when you are not thinking about eating, but you need something to do with your hands and your mouth while you are thinking about something else entirely. I had not kept count. It did not matter. I sat and waited. The recovery team stopped at the outer wire and held there. I could see through the panel gap that their vehicles were a different configuration than the morning's survey element. Lower profile, no extended sensor arms, the rear chassis wider and built for carrying capacity rather than instrument deployment. These were not analysts. These were the people who came after the analysts had finished and told them where to go. I watched them through the gap without moving. 11 minutes, per the intelligence briefings on Vethrak recovery operations, was consistent with a low-resolution census sweep. The broad area scan that recovery teams ran before committing personnel to a position. Their equipment was not as precise as the advanced survey elements, which operated at the level of individual vital sign discrimination. The recovery team's census equipment was designed for broad area assessment. Is there metabolic activity above threshold in this zone? Yes or no? A cruder instrument, calibrated to the same species-specific baselines, but without the individual resolution. The question was whether what we were showing would clear the threshold on that cruder scale. What we were showing at 19:30 hours was this: 23 patients and 6 mobile wounded in various states of rest, horizontal in their cots in the late afternoon amber light, running the numbers they had been running all day. Suresh was at 35.6 and had fallen asleep over Nwasu's notebook. Yaw was at 37.8 with his fever, but 37.8 is within normal human range, and his other numbers were what they were. Morrow had a pulse of 44 and a respiratory rate of 5. Brannon had a pulse of 36 and was asleep. And I had a pulse of 41. I had been monitoring my own pulse throughout the afternoon, not obsessively but at the same interval I monitored everyone else's. Every 45 minutes, 2 fingers to the wrist, 30 seconds count. It had been coming down all day. The 6 hours of inactivity and the 2 short periods of sleep I had managed in the afternoon had brought it down from 51 to 41. I had noted this at each measurement and had not known quite how to feel about it. It was a better number by any medical standard, and by the morning's calculation, 41 was a better number by a different standard as well. The recovery team held at the wire. I ate the cracker. I want to say clearly that I did not know, in those 11 minutes, what the scan was returning. I had a theory, the same theory I had built in the 8 minutes of the morning scan and refined through the day, but a theory is not a certainty, and there is a quality of waiting that is different from any other kind of waiting, which is the waiting that comes from having done everything you can do and arriving at the part where the answer is not in your hands. I had done what I could do. My patients were resting. I was resting. The numbers were what they were. The instrument would read what the instrument would read. I breathed slowly. I ate the cracker. The light through the panel gaps was amber going to red now, the late angle making the bars on the floor longer and thinner, stretching across the aluminum toward the far wall. I watched the light and counted my breaths and did not count time. The recovery team's vehicles moved. I heard the drive units engage, a different sound than the morning's survey element, heavier and more deliberate, the sound of vehicles built for load rather than precision. I heard the sound change as the vehicles turned. They drove away. The sound of them receded up the basin road and faded and was gone, and the aid station was quiet in the late light. I sat still for a moment after the sound was gone, not because I needed to, the situation was clear enough, but because the specific quality of stillness after a thing has passed is something you do not break abruptly. I sat with it. Then I updated my tag, Pulse 41, Resp 10, Temp 36.5. I clipped it back to my collar. I made the log entry, 1941 hours, recovery element departed perimeter without entry. Classification confirmed, non-viable, extraction window holding. I went and checked on Suresh. She was asleep over the notebook, genuinely asleep this time, the pencil still loosely held in her hand. I took the pencil from her carefully and set it on the cot beside her without waking her. Her pulse was 61. Her temperature was 35.6. I stood there for a moment in the amber light and looked at her and thought about the morning's 11 minutes and what she had done in them. Then I went back to my cot. I sat down. I looked at the cracker box. They drove away. I sat very still for a moment after the sound was gone. Then I updated my own tag, Pulse 41, Resp 10, Temp 36.5. I stared at the numbers for a few seconds. I clipped the tag back to my collar. 2 vehicles had come to the wire. Both times the scan had returned the same result. We were, by every measurement their systems could take, not there. Except that we were there, and we had a cracker, and Brannon had a map, and Morrow had an irrigation manual he had read twice, and Nwasu had a notebook, and Hassel had 9 more hours in her and knew it, and the crackers tasted like salted cardboard, and I was on my 8th of the day. At 3:50 hours the following morning, the extraction flight came in on a low approach from the south, running dark. No lights, minimal acoustic signature, flying the valley's sensor shadow at 50 meters above the basin floor. I heard it before I saw it, a change in the air pressure, a low vibration through the panels that I recognized, and that brought most of the station awake in the few seconds before the vehicle cleared the ridge. Brannon was already up. I do not know when he woke. When I turned around, he was standing at the entrance to the module, boots on, jacket on, his maps folded in his breast pocket. He had his pack. He did not look like a man who had spent the past 8.5 hours resting under doctor's instructions, but I had checked on him at 200 and he had been asleep, so some amount of resting had occurred. He said, "I will take the first group." I said, 11 patients. Slow pace. Slow pace, he agreed. We loaded 23 patients and 6 mobile wounded in 41 minutes. I was one of the last in. I had done a final pass through the station, collecting tags, checking the monitoring equipment, going through the protocol in order because the protocol in order is what you do. I collected 29 tags and put them in a bag. I turned off the equipment that needed turning off. I looked at the space, the cots, the light coming blue-gray through the panels in the pre-dawn, the smell of antiseptic and 11 months of people living in it, and I went to the transport. Brannon's pulse when I loaded him was 41. His temperature was 37.1. He had slept and his body had done what bodies do when they sleep, which is restore. He told me he was fine. I told him I was aware of that. He did not ask me anything else. The transport cleared the basin at 4:35, and I watched the basin floor get small beneath us, and then disappear behind the ridge. I have the tags still. All 29 of them. They are in a box on the shelf in my office in a rubber-banded stack in the order I collected them. The top one is mine. Pulse 41, Resp 10, Temp 36.5, status. Yellow, note lack L forearm closed, monitoring. I look at it sometimes. I want to say something about the crackers before I close this statement, because the inquiry's draft summary reduces the event to its mechanism. The Vethrak viability threshold, the below baseline readings, the survey result, and leaves out what was happening on the other side of those numbers. The mechanism is correct. The mechanism is what made it possible, but a mechanism is not a story, and the story is what I have been asked to provide. The story is this. The Vethrak built a system for measuring whether we were still in the fight. They built it carefully over 400 years against 17 species, and they got it right by every reasonable standard. Below the threshold, you are not viable. You are done. You are a recovery site. What they did not build, and what I do not think is possible to build, is a measurement for the gap between what a person's numbers say and what the person is doing with those numbers. Morrow's pulse was 44, and he was reading his manual for the third time because there was nothing else to read, and he intended to understand irrigation systems completely before this was over. Suresh's temperature was 35.2, and she was watching through the gap in her blanket and making tactical decisions. Brannon's pulse was 39, and he had been planning a 14-kilometer supply walk for 18 hours. And I had a pulse of 51, borderline, marginal, possibly below threshold after the afternoon's quiet, and I was eating a cracker, not because it was a statement, but because I was hungry and I had somewhere to be, and stopping was not something I had in me that day. The instruments read everything correctly. They read every number in that station, and every number was accurate. The numbers said, not viable, and the people wearing the numbers said, yes, and here is what we are doing anyway. I do not know how to build an instrument that measures the end. I have thought about it for 3 years, and I do not have a design for it. What I know is that there is a difference between what a body reads at the floor and what is happening inside the person wearing that body, and that the Vethrak system could not see across that gap, and that the gap is where we were. The tags are in the box. The crackers are gone. I finished the box on the transport because I was still hungry and because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. The triage tag on my collar said I should not have been doing much of anything. I was on my 9th cracker of the day, and we were flying out of Karev Basin, and the Vethrak recovery team had come and scanned and turned around and gone home. I do not know what they logged in their recovery site record for the position at Karev Basin. I know they came back eventually, because the position was listed in the sector clearance documentation that was captured later in the campaign. I know what they found when they came back. An empty aid station, stripped of equipment and personnel, with 29 triage tags in a neat stack on the floor inside the entrance, held together with a rubber band. I left them there deliberately. I do not know if that was the right thing to do. I have thought about it and I think it was, but my reasoning may not be sound. What I wanted them to see was, the tags were filled out correctly, the numbers were accurate, the assessment was not wrong. The people wearing the tags had just not finished yet. That is the account. I have nothing to add.